Hey, good morning, everyone, and welcome. Go ahead and grab a seat. Thank you for coming on a less brisk than it was last Tuesday, but still a winter's day. We're really happy that you're all joining us here at CSIS. We were just remarking in the coffee room how much it seems like we've changed. We've returned to a time where frenetic action. The president is making all sorts of claims about public policy. No one's quite sure what the implementation of these things is going to look like. And just a week ago, shortly after President Trump was inaugurated, he signed a flurry of executive orders, both, I would say 70% wiping out the climate agenda of the Biden administration, certainly everything that was done by executive action, but also dramatically changing the course of American energy policy. And we wanted to get together today with a few experts to talk about what those things may mean. Everyone in the community is trying to comprehend them, trying to parse out where this may be going, both in terms of policy and markets. And so our goal today is to have a conversation with some of our most knowledgeable friends on those matters. We will have a chance to invite questions from our in-person audience today. So please, as you are hearing our early part of the conversation, think about what you may want to hear from this group, and we'll run a microphone at the end of the part. Just one notice of business. If an alarm goes off or anything else, please just follow the instructions of a CSIS staff member, and our rally point is right across the street on the square there. I'm Joseph Majkut. I'm the director of our program. If we haven't met before, welcome. Please let me introduce my panel. We got Mike Catanzaro. Mike is a long-time former NSC leader on energy and now an advocate and a senior advisor here at CSIS. Kevin Book, also a senior advisor here at CSIS and the leader of Clearview Energy Partners. And it's my pleasure to introduce to you all Clay Seigle, who has joined our team here at CSIS as senior fellow and holds the James Schlesinger Chair in Energy Geopolitics. Clay has a long history in energy analysis, energy markets, and geopolitical analysis, advising mainly in the private sector, but governments as well. And he'll be leading our work here at CSIS on oil and gas issues. Gentlemen, welcome all.
Thank you. Morning.
I just want to head right down the line. As I said at the beginning, we've got a flurry of EOs. We've got the return of the energy dominance agenda. And I'd love to hear just some early thoughts before we dive into the details, kind of where you think things stand today and how much the last week has met your expectations. Mike, maybe we can begin with you.
Sure. Well, it's great to be here. Thank you, Joseph, and thanks to CSIS. I can't say the following word enough: implementation, implementation, implementation. EOs are fantastic, and we see that this has now become a pattern practice for incoming presidents to issue a lot of executive orders right at the beginning of their presidencies. And that's great because executive orders serve two key functions. One is to communicate very clearly to the public what the priorities for the administration are going to be. They help signal to the public that the president is getting started on carrying out campaign promises. And executive orders are binding on the executive branch, and so they do tell internally to officials sitting in seats who are going to implement the policy what it is they need to be doing, how they're supposed to be doing it, when they're supposed to be doing it. So that's good. But at the end of the day, executive orders, as you mentioned, Joseph, can be written as easily as they can be wiped away. And so President Biden wiped away just about all of President Trump's first-term executive orders that I worked on, and President Trump came in and did the same with President Biden. So the real key now, when the rubber meets the road, is actually how the agencies carry out the orders in the executive orders. And that's where things can get very tricky, because as folks in this room well know, carrying out administrative regulations and policy can get bogged down in infighting. You have a bureaucracy that may not be always aligned, particularly with this administration and where it's going, that can slow you down. You can get tripped up on process. You have to, if you're undoing regulations, have to go through the Administrative Procedure Act notice and comment process. We have a post-Chevron world that we're all living in now, which means that it may not be as straightforward as when you're deregulating as it is regulating. I think President Trump and his team may find that now you have to get the best interpretation of a statute, not just a reasonable one. And so that pendulum swing that goes back and forth, we might see over time it not swinging back and forth as much as it once was. So you have administrative issues, you have process issues, you have court issues and court challenges. So there are a lot of obstacles standing in the way of the administration carrying out this agenda. So it can take years sometimes to undo a regulation. It can take 2 years just to get to court, and then by the time your administration is over, you're saying, my gosh, we didn't really accomplish what we set out to accomplish. So again, EOs are great, and there's a lot of activity, and particularly on the Republican side, they're feeling awfully triumphant and flexing their muscles at the moment. But again, we've got a lot of work to do. The administration has a lot of work to do, so stay tuned.
Kevin, when you wrote for CSIS a piece, I believe in 2017, on what does the energy dominance agenda actually look like, where are we today?
Well, Joseph, the term has never been defined to the best of my knowledge, leaving the rest of us room to fill it in.
Clearly, you're not reading my tweets.
Did you define it?
Yes, I did.
Well, that's the rest of us. You filled it in. I did so as well, and I think that the original definition that we gave it at Clearview was to refer to as an export-focused production policy. But Dominance 2.0 looks a little different. It's more zero-sum. There's talk of sanctions and pressure on other producers, tariffs on other producers. Who had on their bingo card that the first producer likely to face tariffs was going to be Colombia? If you did, I have a job offer waiting for you. Please come talk afterwards. But pressure for adding supply to a market that is well supplied means perhaps a different version of dominance, and also a more muscular form of intervention on the regulatory side. So looking at the EOs, Mike just made it sound so easy. All you do is write an executive order and you're done. He just explained, I think, the complexities. I would offer sort of a framing thought, maybe two framing thoughts. One is that EOs can do three things, basically. They can direct, they can actually take action, or they can signal. And I think a lot of what we got in the energy-related EOs were really signals of dominance with direction for agencies. There were very few actual actions, but of those directions and signals, boy, were there some of them. Let me roll back to the week before the EO deluge, the dominance deluge, if you will, and go to the hearing between soon-to-be Administrator Designate Lee Zeldin, where he's in a back and forth with Ed Markey. And Ed Markey says, do you agree, Mr. Zeldin, that the Clean Air Act obligates the EPA to regulate carbon dioxide as a pollutant? And he says, no, it authorizes it. Mm-hmm. That was an important back and forth. Now, in a confirmation hearing, I think most confirmation hearings, what you want to do is get through without causing controversy. If you get a question like that, maybe the thing to say is, I'm sorry, it's loud in here, Mr. Senator, I can't hear you, or to filibuster until he interrupts. That was a very direct sign that they were going after the endangerment finding. If you go to the Unleashing American Energy EO, which would come out several days later, Section 6F of that EO says to take a look at the endangerment finding. This is the heart of the Obama-Biden climate policy, using the regulatory apparatus of the Clean Air Act. This isn't a question of pruning the methane rule. This is a question of a kill shot at the center of the regulatory agenda that began with the endangerment finding in 2009. And it says to evaluate the continuing legality and applicability of it within 30 days. So as directions go, that's a pretty muscular direction. Now the questions, there are real questions raised by if you should succeed in this pursuit of deep deregulation in this muscular format, what does that do to some of the investments that are in place today? What does it do to some of the momentum that's been put in place by industry players to address some of the things that derived from Section 202 sub-A sub-1 of the Clean Air Act in December of 2009 that became regulations that industry has embraced? There's complexity to that goes beyond implementation. There's now also questions of essentially cohesion and where you're creating deregulatory pressures that are not going to be uniformly supported, where that implementation challenge can include both a government side and an industry side. So yes, much to do with EOs. I think as we go on in the discussion, we'll get into more. But let me just close with one last thing, a second framing thought I promised you. For those of you who haven't been doing this a long time, or if you've been doing it recently and forgotten how it began, I have a term of art for you, and that term of art is INFOMO. It's like regular fear of missing out, but for information. It comes from everywhere now. There are a lot of spontaneous declarations that require real analysis, real thought, and careful consideration. And you don't know when you're going to get them or where you're going to get them. So welcome to the INFOMA era 2.0.
You know, it's actually very shocking as I was reading the EOs on Monday evening of last week, the number of 30, 60, and 90-day deadlines that are applied to the different agencies. I sort of chuckled to myself and I was like, oh, I'm glad I'm not in government, right? I'm gonna put on a jazz record and like drink a little bit of coffee and just think about the poor souls who have to do all this work in the next 3 months. Clay, Kevin raised the issue of Colombia. Part of the energy dominance agenda does appear to be a stronger international stature. You're a keen observer of international oil markets, of geopolitical risk. What is your sense of how much this is shaking markets, how market observers are looking at things, and what are the implications of a sort of new, very, very volatile U.S. when it comes to international energy policy?
Sure. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Pleasure to be with you back here in my old stomping grounds in downtown DC, and what a time to come back and to be part of the discussion. I guess a few things really struck me with all the activity and declarations last week. And apropos to your question, I mean, the first one just is how much of this is ritual, declaratory, rhetorical versus is going to really try to be translated into concrete policy measures. And this thing, as Mike said earlier, this does happen every 4 years, where it's kind of out with the old, in with the new. Biden did the same when he came in, perhaps not to the same scope that we saw last week, but it is a bit of a ritual, right, every 4 years. And so we need to find out the staying power of the various elements of these EOs and how they translate into practical policy consequences. A second thing that occurred to me is just trying to ascertain how feasible. So if I were advising these guys and the priorities that were given through, for example, the Unleashing EO, well, what needs to happen for American energy and resources to really be unleashed and to grow supply? What's required to grow supply, and to what extent does that harmonize with the stated goal, I think, from the Davos remarks last week about lowering oil prices? And are there some inherent contradictions there? Oil producers generally don't want to see a lower price environment when they decide how much to invest going forward. I think that's true for producing countries, and it's true for producing businesses as well. Another thing that really struck me with what we were seeing in the barrage of declarations last week was a question about energy security as relates to trade policy and trade restriction policy. And I'm talking specifically about proposed tariffs and increased sanctions. Those things don't lower oil prices. Those things raise oil prices, right? I mean, we just work here. We're market analysts, and we'll tell you how supply-demand fundamentals and changes to those fundamentals are going to affect price. And when you make it more expensive to import a commodity like crude feedstock from a very secure supply source, which is Canada, into a region of the Midwestern United States that really doesn't have access to a lot of other crude intake, the refiners in that area are going to be faced with higher costs that are going to have to be passed on to consumers. And it seems to be a little bit potentially in conflict with a prerogative for lowering prices. So seeing how all those things shake out and what becomes real policy directive versus kind of the initial rhetorical stuff is going to be really important to watch.
One of the places I want to start is, thank you all for being here, energy emergency versus climate emergency. While the Biden administration never formally declared a climate emergency, there's always a question as to whether they wanted to do that. One of the executive orders from last week declares an energy emergency, which could feel a little strange given that the U.S. is producing historical levels of both oil and natural gas. We are rapidly expanding solar and wind generation in the U.S. But if you take it a little bit seriously, you look at some of the challenges we've got ahead. We want to be a larger exporter. Certainly this administration does, of various energy products. We've got this AI revolution, which could dramatically impact the power sector. And energy pricing has gone up over the last 4 years in a way that consumers are feeling as part of inflation. So when we think about this sort of energy emergency, I can actually put myself on the side of going, okay, well, we actually do need to produce more for a variety of reasons. Fine. But an energy emergency also creates a lot of potential authorities and conflicts with the states. So I'd love to, Kevin and Mike, particularly dial in on your experience kind of there when we look at the Defense Production Act, federal eminent domain, the use of the Army Corps to potentially build energy infrastructure explicitly on the West Coast or in the Northeast of the United States. What does this imply that the administration may be trying to do? Is it creating tools for gamesmanship, or is it a totally different arrangement of how the federal government treats state and regional energy policy?
Well, so first I would say that presidents learn from their predecessors. And although Biden never declared a climate emergency per se, he did wield emergency authorities on energy on several occasions that you mentioned, the March and June 2022 DPA applications for clean energy development, and notably suspending tariffs under emergency authority. One of the most remarkable ones, though, concerned ethanol. His E15 order invoked a part of the Clean Air Act, which is supposed to be used for acute emergencies in the for the shortest period of time in the narrowest geography. Declared in advance that he would run it for the entirety of the summer to blend E15, and did so for 3 summers, which is a very muscular use of a very temporary emergency authority. Trump actually did an infrastructure emergency invocation in his COVID orders, sort of in the tail end, to try to expedite infrastructure permitting under NEPA. So each of these is sort of an iterative step. And so what we're seeing is, I think, the momentum building towards more use of emergency powers. The challenge is that the climate emergency that Biden never unlocked came with some statutory authorities that were quite powerful, including the power to stop exports by directing transportation under the Aviation and Transportation Security Act, and also to license under the Energy Policy and Conservation Act as modified when the crude oil export ban was lifted.
Right.
Those authorities were there. The power to produce more is harder, and the emergency produce more powers may rely either on innate presidential authorities or the organic statutes within some of the departments and agencies themselves. So they're exploring what the landscape looks like. There's a lot of direction to explore rather than action. There were some expediting requirements built in, though, for the Endangered Species Act, which I think most of us hadn't seen some of those provisions ever really discussed in any detail. I was one of them. But now to convene a committee to approve Section 7 exceptions on a regular basis, that was news. So there were some new steps. And I think the implication is that there could be much more coming.
Right. Well, one of my favorite things about the modern age is you can use GPT to understand, well, what exactly are these Section 7 exemptions? What might they look like? Section 404 of the Clean Water Act. What does that do, actually? Mike, what is your thought on this question? I mean, these are really substantial federal powers that the administration seems to be attempting to carve out for itself. How can that really play out in the context of the White House?
Yeah, I mean, that's a real question. I mean, let's go to the top of the order where the president declares the emergency based on his inherent authority under the Constitution, but also his authority under the National Emergencies Act, which I believe was passed in 1977. Interesting thing about that statute, when you read through it, there's no definition of what an emergency is. So the president has a lot of latitude here. Now, when you actually get down to the actual implementation, you reference Clean Water Act, Section 404. Kevin referenced the God Squad and Section 7 consultations. When you start getting into those statutes and you carry them out, those statutes and the regulations to implement them actually do have definitions of emergencies. Clean Water Act talks about acts of God and casualties and significant economic dislocations, and Endangered Species Act also has similar language. So when you're going forward and, for example, you have to do a Section 7 consultation or an alternative to a Section 7 consultation, you still have to demonstrate, or the director of the Fish and Wildlife Service has to demonstrate that that alternative procedure is as stringent as the normal course of going through a Section 7 consultation. The God Squad, it's more complicated than maybe people realize. Yeah, you get a bunch of agency heads and affected states sitting around a table. You can only go to that squad if you have a denied permit in your hand, and that permit had to be denied based on the fact that you couldn't implement the measures that were outlined to deal with the Endangered Species Act in the permit. And so they have to evaluate that and do all kinds of weighing and balancing, and then basically determine at the end of the day the economic significance of this project outweighs concerns about endangered species. It takes time. You have to go through a process. And as I said at the outset, everyone in this room knows there's going to be litigation surrounding it. So when you read the order, you know, what sort of stands out to me is there are several references to the grid all throughout. I mean, that to me is where I think, talking to folks who help draft these orders, that's where they feel like they are in the strongest legal position, because the state of the grid right now, I think it can be conceded, is extremely tenuous. And if you look at projections, obviously the next 5 years, I think we could have a drinking game every time someone in Washington talks about AI data centers. We'd all be very drunk. But at the end of the day, those projections, even if they're, say, 50% wrong, I mean, we're really in serious trouble here. So what does that mean with respect to the grid? You know, when Carter declared kind of a regional energy emergency, I think in 1977, he said, Americans, you know, will test our character, and this is basically the moral equivalent of war, but instead we're going to be building rather than destroying. I think that's probably what's in President Trump's head, too. We're going to be building, hopefully. But building what? New power plants? Okay, yeah, you can justify that, I suppose. Building new natural gas pipelines to get gas to those power plants? Interesting. Well, then you could argue, well, we need to produce more natural gas to get it to the pipelines, to get it to the power plants. So how far upstream do you actually go here? That will be tested. I suspect, you know, Section 202C and Section 215, the Federal Power Act, will be invoked to keep existing baseload, i.e. coal plants, open longer. That's a messy process, though. You can identify which plants are supposed to stay open, and then you have to figure out how to compensate them. So all of these measures, even when you're talking about a, quote, emergency, do take time to carry out and effectuate. And yes, in the executive orders, as is standard fare, you know, there are very, very tight timelines. One of the issues, though, is, for example, the directive to the CEQ chair to carry out the NEPA directives and the Unleashing American Energy EO. There is no CEQ chair right now. There's somebody sitting in the chief of staff spot who's sort of acting right now, and she's trying to figure out, how do I put this guidance together in 30 days? So there's all kinds of challenges for how these emergency authorities can be used, but Kevin's exactly right. There are a lot of them, and they will be carried out, and there is more to come, believe me.
I want to get to NEPA in a minute because that deserves a little bit of time. But let's just think on this emergency declaration. Two more interesting facets. One, coming off your answer, Mike, like, you know, so the Northeast is critically power starved. A couple states there are really riding on the edge of reliability in the electricity sector. A gas pipeline has been proposed several times, which will run through the state of New York. It's been rejected on clean water grounds. The state of New York doesn't want that gas pipeline coming through. You know, this could be a potential real conflict between the sort of federal government acting on this emergency order and states having a role in infrastructure development. I'd be interested in your thoughts on that, as well as, you didn't mention this, but electricity transmission. Another kind of infrastructure which takes a long time to permit and build. It's an important part of maintaining the grid and grid reliability, as well as cost efficiency. You know, it's not in these orders, but it might be there implicitly. Your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question in terms of, I mean, we went through this in the first Trump administration under Section 401 of the Clean Water Act, which was invoked by the state of New York to block an interstate pipeline going into the Northeast to deliver natural gas. And so the Trump administration came in and tried to fix that, and the Biden administration came in and unfixed it, and now the Trump administration will unfix that. So yeah, it's that's what we're dealing with here. I think with respect to the states when it comes to transmission, electric transmission, I mean, as a friend who works in the Energy and Commerce Committee told me, for Republicans, it's a generation problem, it's not a transmission problem.
Yeah.
So I don't know how keen this administration is going to be when it comes to building transmission, particularly to connect it to renewables, which are obviously disfavored in these EOs and will be in this administration. Particularly, too, you have a lot of red states operating through the regulatory commissioners who, when we saw last year in the Manchin-Barrasso bill, when there was a very aggressive electricity title, they bitterly opposed it, and Republicans saw it now, or see it now, as basically a third rail. So I'm not sure how transmission will build out under this administration or how eager they're going to be to do it. I think it's going to be all about power plants and gas pipelines. And yes, if states try to get in the way, if they're obstructing interstate commerce, there will be aggressive measures to override them. And
Right.
we'll probably end up again in the Supreme Court to figure it out.
The second thing on there's so much here. It's like I'm hard pressed to even fit this in an hour. But the second very interesting part from the emergency declaration EO is, you know, which energies do we apply in the emergency? Crude oil, natural gas, least condensates, NGLs, refined products, uranium, coal, biofuels, geothermal heat, the kinetic movement of flowing water, which is my favorite, and critical minerals. Interestingly.
That's an Office of Legal Counsel term that they like to throw in.
So, a couple notable exceptions there. Your guys' thoughts on that part of the EO?
Section 8A of the EO leaves out solar and wind. Was anyone surprised?
You got the critical minerals in there, right?
But
critical mineral
indirectly,
intensity of
component
those.
parts of turbines,
Yeah.
component parts of the value chain are implied. I would notice also that electrified transportation didn't seem to be on the list.
Oh no.
So I think for the emergency authorities that are brought to bear, that implies a certain exclusion. But it doesn't necessarily imply the eradication of or the elimination of policies that support in ways that are useful to the president's agenda. So the question is a practical one, which I think if you go back to the first term, the best example I can give you on sort of this green question, which is looming, it has been looming for years, is NAFTA. The president campaigned against NAFTA, and the USMCA replaced NAFTA. But a substantial portion of the original NAFTA, the genetic material, is still there in the USMCA. There was a certain amount of change, but a lot of also repackaging and to some degree rebranding. You have to ask, will there be a similar undertaking to follow in this administration with the green agenda, with the parts of the IRA, which are consistent with Section 2 of the Unleashing Order, which are consistent with the objectives of economic growth and energy dominance? And I think it's a reasonable expectation that there probably will be. Now, this is not inside the emergency area. I think in this case, the emergency is telling you where the focal areas are going to be. But if you ask, who is the president who put in place very strong protections for the U.S. domestic solar industry, and who was working in the White House when it happened, you would get Donald J. Trump and of course, Mike Catanzaro.
Thanks for bringing that up.
Yeah, but so there is a pragmatism to this president that I think that we don't want to overlook. And so I think it is quite significant. It's a very significant doctrinal statement that 8A omits two very prominent transition resources. There are other signs that they may not be excluded entirely.
Yep. I would like to move on to Unleashing American Energy. Are you guys game?
Yeah, let's do it.
Unleashing American Energy does 9 important things, but basically argues the U.S. needs to unlock its energy resources and particularly wants to promote production on federal lands, undo a lot of the regulations coming from the Biden administration, set right the social cost of carbon, pause for the time being spending under the Inflation Reduction Act and the IIJA, resume the licensing of LNG terminals, and basically rewrite all of the implementation of NEPA from fundamentally. Where do we even begin? Clay, go ahead.
The preamble of the Unleashing EO, and I'm definitely paraphrasing here, says that essentially Biden-era limitations on permitting for new oil and gas and ability to access federal lands is impeding the development of these American resources, including oil. So I asked myself, how can we quantify that? To what extent have we seen that? And I think the elephant in the room is, can changing that regulatory environment increase oil supply as declared to be an objective? Well, as we all know, since we track the statistics, that U.S. oil supply grew from about 11 million barrels a day to 13.5 recently, when this previous administration left office. So U.S. oil supply has been increasing in the last regulatory environment. Could easing those regulations and providing more access to federal lands, it's definitely on the industry's wish list, to be sure. But what tangible effect can it have in growing production? And I think the reason I call this in the elephant in the room is because this gets to a fundamental reality about the oil market, which is that supply growth is not being restrained, for the most part, by government. It's being restrained by Wall Street. It's being restrained by the capital markets that have different objectives for their investments in upstream and in other parts of the energy chain than they did in earlier chapters of, let's say, Shale 1.0. I was looking over some investor presentations at the major E&P companies recently in preparation for this talk, and comparing them to the stuff that we saw from the same types of companies in that segment in years past, like in the mid-teens. And in those days, it was grow, grow, grow. If you looked at the first slide on all these presentations, it was here's how much we're growing production and sinking money into growing production. Because that's in that earlier phase what they were being rewarded for. If you look at those same presentations, the first slide in substantially every one of them is capital discipline. It's return on capital employed. It's the number of dividends and the size of the dividends that they are using to make free cash flow available to shareholders. And it's about share repurchase agreements, which also serve the same effect. That's the lens by which operating companies are being measured and rewarded by their investors. And so in that environment, government can and should do everything it can to foster resilience and unleashing supply growth if that's the stated objective. But we should understand the limitations. If industry got every single thing on its checklist approved through EOs and through the policies that will follow, to what extent is that 13.5 million barrels a day going to materially move higher? It depends on supply and demand realities. And there's also another question to be asked here about unleashed, and I'm not going to pick up too much on the rhetoric, but how many people in the audience are dog people? How many people have a dog and love their dog, right? Are they unleashed? I mean, do they live their lives unleashed? Right? What would be the prospectivity of their safety and security if they were completely unleashed and out in traffic? Right? So you take my point. So leashing has a negative connotation as written and as declared in this EO. But on the other hand, the capital markets are serving a really useful function in helping to regulate the supply and demand of oil from the United States and in the context of overall global supply-demand balances. So I like this lens for interpreting unleashed and deciding where the policymakers will take it.
Any thoughts? I mean,
first, just point of order, point of privilege, I am so glad, Joseph, that you've recruited such great talent for the team. Clay, we're so glad to have you.
Because I'm a dog person?
Well, in the era of the Doge, dogs are going to be very, very prominent. First of all, I agree absolutely with the emphasis on capital discipline being a constraining factor. And though rig counts are not a perfect proxy because greater production efficiency has been sort of part of the trend in shale, the rig count response to price in the last trough to peak is about 1/3 what it was in the two prior trough to peak intervals. And that's a real manifestation. If you look at how money's going into the ground. Again, some of that's efficiency, some of that's reluctance to produce uneconomically. Yeah. But there's also a latency, to some degree, to the effects of policy on the production options. So deregulation provides an option, not an obligation to produce. We don't have a national oil company, and not everyone will take that option. But the option set did change over the Biden years. Permitting was brisk, yes, and production was absolutely so. But the Biden administration's policy was one of selling less frequently, more fragmented parcels on stricter fiscal terms. That does have an impact over time. It just hasn't come through yet. The decision to produce is many years after the lease sale, and not as many lease sales at less favorable financial parameters means that you're not going to necessarily get as much in the future. Now, that will still be probably secondary and distantly to the global supply-demand balances and investor appetites. And we are in a return of capital phase that doesn't leave a lot of room for the sort of the heady days of the shale gale in the mid-teens.
But maybe in a few years you find yourself in a very different situation. If a lot of new production is available or a lot of new leasing has come on favorable terms.
Well, there's just a latency.
Yeah. So much to talk about. One thing I think is really important at this moment, as the administration has come in, not just their own agenda, but the sort of overspending from the federal government is a priority of the OMB and of the president, of Elon Musk, and they've halted all spending under IIJA and IRA across a wide variety of energy products. For review, are these projects consistent with the policies of the new administration? Asking you guys to forecast. What do you think the fate of some of that is going to be? I mean, hydrogen hubs programs, DAC hubs, a lot of that was passed on a bipartisan basis through the IIJA. But Amtrak support, I don't know if this administration is going to be particularly supportive How should we read that move, and what do you think the future holds? Maybe Mike, if you have some thoughts.
Yeah, I think that with respect to the IIJA, there's a little bit more sympathy to that statute just because it did have some Republican support. When it comes to the IRA, absolutely not. But you saw just what OMB did, the other night, which was they issued another memo basically saying across-the-board financial assistance is hereby suspended and paused until we can figure out if it's aligning with the president's priorities. Make no mistake, this is all part of an effort to drive the impoundment crisis, as you may call it that, all the way to the Supreme Court. There is no doubt about that's where they're going. And if you read Russ Vaught's testimony, if you look at the folks who are going into OMB and things that they have said publicly, they believe the Budget and Impoundment Control Act is unconstitutional, and the president does have the authority to determine how he can or not spend money and appropriated dollars. And so I know there's folks who's trying to parse things and say, well, if it's obligated, then they have a contract and they have to spend it. Certainly you could point to statutes and say that is the case, and I get it, but that's not what this administration, this OMB, that's not how they view it. And so all of this funding under the IRA is at serious risk, and if you are counting on, if you don't have money already in your pocket and you're hoping to get money via a grant, or you've got a conditional commitment via the LPO, anything related to that, you should be very concerned, because you may have to wait a very long time for, again, the Supreme Court to weigh in on this. And, under the Budget and Impoundment Control Act, the president is supposed to go to Congress with proposed rescissions, and Congress has 45 days to sort of figure it out. But other than that, the president, I agree, he is under the law obligated to spend appropriated dollars. But again, that's just not the viewpoint. There's the law and then what people who implement the law think the law says. And this is going to be one of the most fascinating aspects of this administration. And at some point, what will be interesting to see is if Republicans over time start speaking out against what this OMB is going to try to do. They're not going to do it now. But next year, we head into an election year, and Republicans have a 2-seat majority in the House, and you're looking at holding up funding, particularly in, say, a red district where they've got hydrogen hubs or other projects related to the IRA. Are they going to start speaking out and opposing this and creating problems through the appropriations process where you have Congress, Republican Congress and a Republican president at odds with one another? That has happened in the past, and we'd be surprised to see that happening in the future.
Could I, just one of the things that, so first of all, I want to amplify what Mike just said, because I think he said the really important thing. They appear to be precipitating a crisis so that they can challenge the law. And that is not a surprise, because again, the testimony, Russ Vought testified in front of 2 different committees, and he was very, very clear. The president believes that the Impoundment Act is illegal and intends to challenge it. And so this is a challenge of that. But there are questions about the obligated versus obligated and dispersed. If it's been dispersed, I don't know how you can claw it back. It seems like that's very difficult. But there were murmurings prior to the election that Republicans were interested in going after the undispersed obligated funds, which sounded like a stretch. I think a lot of people in the conventional mindset that they found themselves said, well, that will never happen. And then there was questions about what does this mean for tax credits? And the word appropriated is a very important word. The appropriated funds and the programmatic spending are one thing, but by all appearances, tax credits are another. This is not to say these are not part of the same doctrinal orientation vis-a-vis IRA green energy incentives, but that tax expenditures, which are technically foregone federal revenues that don't come directly from appropriations, are a separate matter likely to be dealt with through Congress, with significant influence, of course, from the federal government. But wait, there is nexus inside the executive branch to how those tax credits are administered, and it resides within the Treasury and the IRS, and the ability to reinterpret the regulations and guidance that have been issued under the IRA, which I think is a very good expectation, irrespective of what Congress does, and also to redefine what a foreign entity of concern is for one very specific tax credit that could have very big implications. So you have a theory of the case that there's much bigger executive power and a belief that the apparatus of the executive branch should be doing the president's will, and it is being brought to bear on this very vital mechanism of government, which is how money is spent and directed. Watch this space. I agree with Mike. It's going to get very interesting.
I need to rely on the collective wisdom of the group to make sure that we get a chance to hear from them. But there's a few more issues I want to hit. So while you all are thinking about your questions, we're going to have a mic runner come around. Are you guys up for a little bit of a lightning round?
Let's do it.
Quick responses. Up, down votes, yes or no. We begin with Clay. The Unleashing American Energy EO says we're going to end the EV mandate, possibly take away the California waiver. Do you expect that to dramatically change in the course of 5 to 7 years oil demand outlooks in the United States?
Not really. Oil demand in the United States is not growing like it used to, but I think it's an even longer term time horizon than the one outlined here.
Good.
Yeah.
Kevin, we are lifting, the order says to resume the review of LNG export terminals. Just in December, the DOE released its study evaluating the economic and climate impacts of those things. This review says it should also include the energy security of our allies and partners. How is that going to be an important factor?
The DOE has essentially 3 options before it issues new orders for authorizations of exports to non-FTA countries. They can ignore the studies that came out in December. They can reinterpret them, or they can rewrite them. And they've extended the comment period already by a month, which would suggest that they're probably not trying to rewrite in a month. They're probably trying to incorporate a reinterpretation and maybe make the administrative record look more favorable. So I think this is a way that they are guiding the DOE to say, here's what you should emphasize in your reinterpretation.
We're grateful for the deadline extension because it also means the paper I'm writing on this issue can be put into the comment period. Mike, in Section 5 of the Unleashing EO, quote, Executive Order 11991 of May 24, 1977, regarding the protection and enhancement of environmental quality is hereby revoked. How important is this to broader NEPA reform conversations here in Washington?
It's very important. It's interesting in that executive order you referenced from President Carter, he said that environmental impact statements should be clear, concise, and to the point. I don't think anyone in this room who follows NEPA believes that that is the case today. They're anything but clear, they're voluminous, and they're beside the point in many cases. So getting rid of that, and then in combination with that, the DC Circuit, recent DC Circuit decision, which basically said CEQ has no binding authority to issue regulations, and then a forthcoming 7-county case, this case right now before the Supreme Court, which we're expecting will narrow climate and GHG reviews under NEPA. All of those things conspire together along with this administration's desire to streamline NEPA implementing procedures at the agencies. You know, it will be very significant in how NEPA plays out on the ground, but at the end of the day, Congress still needs to step up as they do on so many other issues. But certainly with respect to permitting reform, ultimately changing the game really is going to come from Congress. But still, don't make no bones about it. This is going to be a big deal.
All right, excellent. Thank you so much, guys. We are going to turn to the audience. Please stand and announce yourself, name and affiliation if you have one to share. And please recall, a question has a brief propositional statement and then a sentence which goes up at the end. Thank you.
Thanks for the talk. Sam Bowers from Clean Air Task Force. The question I have is on what's happening outside the US. There's still the European methane standard. The CBAM is going to introduce refined products in 2028, I believe. To what extent do you think oil companies in the US and the administration are thinking about those external things?
Well, so this is a well-considered question. Thank you for it. The carbon border adjustment mechanism, as you mentioned, does not currently include hydrocarbons directly, but implicitly it already sort of does. The baseline sheltered in Europe implies a value chain that imports gas. And so already, I think that it's focusing minds on emissions intensities. And the methane regulation absolutely does so. 2027 sets a target, 2030 binds. So I think for those trying to access regulated markets, the burden of proof is upon them. The CBAM is particularly burdensome in that fashion, in that it says, if you can't prove it to us, we're going to take the worst performers in our sector and apply the emissions intensities from that to you. So to the extent that that data burden can be reinforced by regulation here in the US that provides some sort of backstop, or better still, provides an imprimatur that says the government has mandated a minimum that's compatible with those standards. We don't yet know what the intensity is going to be for gas, although 0.2% seems like a very good guess. That sort of future might look a lot easier for exporters. It probably makes it easier to access those regulated markets. There are differences of opinion about some of the regulations in place today. Some stakeholders think that this is useful and helpful. Some think that it's a non-maintenance capital burden they can't afford. So I think as the regulatory or deregulatory story plays out, we'll hear those voices talking about those overseas markets as a growth increment with great importance, but I'm not sure it's going to be the only consideration.
If I may, I think there was, there's a little bit of subtext in a section that I highlighted last night in preparation for today. In Unleashing American Energy, Section 6, when they're discussing the social cost of carbon, makes this statement: the abuse, of the social cost of carbon, arbitrarily slows regulatory decisions, and by rendering the United States economically, internationally uncompetitive, encourages a greater human impact on the environment by affording less efficient foreign energy producers a greater share of the global energy and natural resource market. I thought that was like kind of an interesting statement as we look at the sort of bubbling, but I would say very early and nascent conversations on the Hill around what our approach to carbon border adjustment or carbon tariffs might be. There is a recognition here that the U.S. at least has the potential to be a cleaner producer than a lot of peers around the world. And of course, it is those border adjustments which will help our market actors realize those advantages. I think that conversation has a long way to develop, but I thought that was a really interesting piece in the O there. Lady in the front.
Hi, thank you so much for this discussion. My name is Ruslana Kochmar, and I'm with Longenecker and Associates. I used to consult the DOE complex, so that's a very interesting subject for me. I know that our job involves sometimes being soothsayers, and so my question is, with the elimination of social cost of carbon, with the IRA being, paused, with the funding, with the hydrogen hubs, we could see that they were trying to really push for it, and 5 out of 7 were already authorized the funding. Well, now everything has been paused. Obviously, that affects private sectors, those companies that were trying to invest in projects. And so my big question and concern is, do you think that especially oil and gas companies like Exxon, Eni are going to follow this suit and kind of like stop on hydrogen projects or investing in that area as much? Do you think they're going to pause as well, or they will just keep doing because they know that things might still, stay the same?
Thank you. I mean, Mike, Kevin, you've both mentioned the sort of investment decisions that are facing companies over the next 3 months, 6 months, and year. Your thoughts on this question?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really interesting question because to me, one thing that I'm going to be watching closely is what seems like a pretty significant disconnect between what companies, corporations in the oil and gas industry may want and what this administration may want to accomplish with policy. I think if they hear from companies coming into the administration, as they inevitably will, that if you pause this funding for an extended period of time, if you roll it back, dial it back, claw it back, you're going to hurt jobs and investment. We're not going to invest in hydrogen. They're going to say, well, that's kind of the point. Is we don't want you to do those things because we don't think those things are viable, and the fact that you need a subsidy means it's really not viable. So I don't think really the pleas from oil and gas companies coming in and asking for IRA subsidies, I don't think they're really going to fall. I think they will fall on deaf ears. And again, that's where the ideological bent of where this administration is, where Republicans in Congress are. And they don't really believe that these investments are, quote, for real. I'm just repeating what I think I'm hearing from folks up on the Hill in the administration. They don't think these investments are going anywhere. They think they're boondoggles, and they think it's a waste of money. And so, again, there's going to be a pretty big disconnect on some of these issues between what oil and gas companies may want and what the administration may want at the end of the day.
So you mentioned the dominance piece I wrote several years ago in the first Trump administration. I wrote another one about anyway and because. There are emissions reduction technologies and policies that are in the money anyway, and there are some that you only pursue because they reduce emissions. So the anyway policies are things that this administration is more supportive of. And the because policies, less so. The because technologies, less so. And clean hydrogen is something for which there's no native existing demand or supply or infrastructure to deliver. And, of the 100 million tons a year of hydrogen that are used, right now, 99% or so are conventional hydrogen. And the price point over and over again looks wide, and it's looking very, very because. So I think that it's going to be challenging for industry to make the case that this is something that they need to pursue. I'm not sure it's impossible. I think anyone who tries to prejudge decisions by this administration will get burned at least a few times.
Right. Well, and there's also the matter that, as Mike said, A lot of those projects are in red states. Congress people like them. They'd like to see that kind of investment continue. And so the future, I think, there is highly uncertain, but certainly there's a big perturbation today. Jen, and then the gentleman in the red tie there, and then we'll probably have to wrap up. Sorry about that. Unless you guys have a few more minutes.
Jennifer Deloy, Bloomberg News. I just wanted to follow up on actually a question that Sam asked on with regard to CBAM and methane. It seems to me that there's a number of areas where the industry, the oil and gas industry in particular, is going to be facing headwinds from this administration despite the energy dominance agenda. Maybe it's methane and the license to operate and sell into Europe. Maybe it is tariffs on Canadian crude. Where are some of the, and obviously drill baby drill doesn't necessarily meet capital discipline, right? Where are some of the other potential areas of conflict where vast portions of the industry, particularly the folks that this president seems keen to listen to, are going to push back against kind of the way his energy dominance agenda is executed in the agencies?
Okay, so this goes back to sort of the mechanism of action and trying to understand what happens inside the decision centers in the administration without being able to see it yet. I think you would reasonably expect that there's a fairly good communication between industry and the administration. That seems to be the case. But the president has made clear certain priorities. And he said several times things that I think would be discordant to most industry ears. We don't need Canada's oil and gas being one of them. And so what is that? Is that a call for education or opportunity for discourse? Or is that a final decision? And I think that's probably more the former than the latter, but a process. Before the exemptions for countries or exclusions for line items and tariffs happen, there's probably a process. And in addition to that, the president has made it clear that it's the American people for whom he's trying to orient these policies. And the dominance isn't being done just for the purposes of the industry. The campaign promise was to lower energy costs. The idea is that lower energy costs are going to reduce interest rates. And these things are going to benefit the end users. And less discussion is going, at least in the rhetorical delivery that we're getting on the public side. So I think that this, for many people in industry, this isn't the end of the story, but the start of the discussion.
Yeah, go ahead, Clay.
I would say I think that the downstream segment will be under particular pressure with what we're hearing coming out of the gate right now. Was having some talks yesterday, and those guys feel like they're under siege. I mean, they're in the business of, in addition to their domestic crude purchases, having a supply of secure, affordable, heavy, and higher sulfur crude oil. And that's what's kind of under siege right now. That's what we get from Canada. That's Urals crude from Russia, which is being squeezed by the new round of sanctions from early January. And is Colombia on or off today? I think it might be off as of today, but it could come back in the future. So for those guys, they're acutely focused on their ability to procure the feedstocks that they need in order to create the fuels that we all need, consumers and businesses here. And there's a question about whether that can be done economically and profitably if these policy directives were to come to fruition.
Right. The one thing, we can go over here, the one thing I'm watching is we're going to unleash LNG. A lot of Chinese buyers are foundational contracts for LNG fleets. And as that tension, that relationship is navigated by the new administration, how much are we happy for having a market-driven LNG export industry is, I think, a big question. Go ahead, sir.
Changing tack. My name is Neil Atkinson. I'm an independent consultant, but I was head of the oil division at the International Energy Agency until fairly recently. And my question relates to the Strategic Petroleum Reserve. I'm not sure if this was actually the subject of an executive order, but Trump did mention it, I think, in the first week, and I think he may have used the phrase, we want to refill it to the brim. It's 400 million barrels now, 700 million or so is the capacity. Your comments, gentlemen, on the feasibility of making any serious progress on that ambition in the next 4 years, and perhaps you might have some comments on whether or not the administration understands that crude oil varies enormously in quality. It's not just a quantity game. Thank you.
My two SPR friends here.
Yeah, I won't presume to know the new group's understanding of those quality differentials just yet. That's quite right for you to point them out. Volumetrically, though, right, it would be a high hurdle to refill it to the top. First of all, there's no budget for it. And so that can come out of the appropriations process, which we will get into soon here in the spring. But, and that's a political decision. So if there's will from political allies and stakeholders on the Hill, then I guess the administration could get funding for it, but it doesn't have any right now. And the second thing also with regard to the rate of the refill, the SPR is designed to discharge a large volume of crude oil into the commercial system, about 4 million barrels per day within a week or a week and a half of the go order. But refilling it is a completely different mechanical process, and it takes much longer to do. That would be the case if certain of the 4 SPR facilities in the Gulf Coast were not undergoing heavy maintenance for life extension programs, but they are, and so that slows down the process even more. It can be done, but it wouldn't be easy.
Just, I think that was most of the answer, but to the part that you mentioned on the political process. So there's still 99.6 million barrels of congressionally mandated sales that are required from the reserve. So technically, even though it's due to crest above 400 million in capacity, it's headed back down below that in the tail end of the decade without a change. That cancellation could be achieved. Those sales could be blocked. You have sort of an en passant barrel delivered into the reserve because you haven't been mandated to sell it, which is what the Biden administration did. But we're talking on the order, if you were canceling those, you're above $30 billion at $80 a barrel in appropriations. And that might seem like a small cost. I have testified to that effect. The insurance value of the SPR is considerably greater than its carrying cost or its fill cost, given that it lowers the price of every barrel in the world. However, the politics of it got a little complicated after the drawdowns in 2022. And I think there are a lot of Republicans who have always had the view that the SPR was an intervention that was unnecessary, particularly in the era of shale, a debatable proposition and one that I think a lot of people in this room might take the other side of. But then there are others who are now particularly activated by what they perceived as a partisan use of the SPR in 2022, which could make getting that funding on a bipartisan basis significantly harder. So it does take that additional money. They emptied the Strategic Petroleum Reserve petroleum account on the fills that are due through May of this year, and that's it. At that point, SPR demand goes to zero.
One last thing to consider is, of course, the price consequence and the market consequence of a massive fill. Because I heard in the Davos remarks that lowering oil prices is an important priority. If you create a new source of demand to the tune of hundreds of millions of barrels, what do you market experts think that's going to do to the price of oil? So we'll see.
Excellent. Where else can we go from constitutional combat to the fineries of SPR management, the social cost of carbon, NEPA, and all these other matters? I want to offer my gratitude to you three for sharing your perspectives today, for all the hard work that each of you do, to our audience for attending, and if you wouldn't mind, with your hearty applause, thanking our panelists today. I'm Joseph Majkut for the CSIS Energy Security and Climate Change Program. Thank you for joining us this morning. We are signing off.